culture. She published a book last year with Yale University Press, which, if I'm not mistaken, will be published in paperback soon.
Yes.
Is that right?
It's out as of, I think, this week, yes.
Okay, this week, okay. So in paperback as well, so you can have a look. Which is entitled Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World. And today she's going to give us a talk on Anna-Maria Garthwaite, who is, I think, mentioned in the book as well. Okay. So her respondent is Ariane Ferrito, who is Associate Professor of 18th Century Social and Cultural British History at Université Paris-Diderot. She works on material culture with a particular emphasis on dress and textile, in particular pockets, which is fascinating, actually. And is there a forthcoming book as well, the Artful Pocket? When is it?
Hopefully 2019. This time for real.
Okay, 2019. So is it on women's pockets, right?
It's women's pockets.
Okay, right. And do you want to say a word about your conference tomorrow? Or?
Yeah, and I would like to extend my thanks to the Séminaire Franco-Britannique to have co-organized this session because, well, the reason Zara is in Paris to start with is because she's going to be the keynote speaker in the conference I'm co-organizing tomorrow and Saturday on Franco-British textile and dress rivalries in the 18th and the 19th centuries.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Where is that?
Oh, sorry. So the conference is co-organized with the IHTP, the Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent, le site de Pouchet. So that's in the 17th arrondissement in Métro Brochamp. That's tomorrow, and the Saturday will take place in the Musée Cognac-Jet in the 3rd arrondissement.
Thank you.
I have programs.
Oh.
Yes.
Sorry, you can't keep them. Have a look.
Bonsoir, merci d'être venu et merci Ariane pour l'invitation. Et maintenant, c'est dommage, je comprends le français et je lis le français, mais je le parle seulement un peu maintenant en anglais. Merci. Two unmarried sisters, one a widow and one a spinster, moved from York to London at the end of the 1720s. And you probably can't see it too well, but this is the...
I'm afraid we can't see it at all.
Not at all.
There are little blinds. Yeah, we're closing the blinds now.
All right, well, take my word for it. This is London, circa 1746. So... There we go. Okay. Two unmarried sisters, one a widow, one a spinster, moved from York to London at the end of the 1720s to this neighborhood in East London, Spitalfields. It was an unlikely time of life for them to relocate, as both were in their early 40s. But they had good reason to do so, and they were hardly alone in their choice. When the sisters arrived in Spitalfields, in London's East End, it was experiencing a building and population boom. They lived on Princes Street, a short walk from the Spitalfields Market, which had been a local fixture since the 1680s. But their block of newly constructed Georgian-style townhouses, some like theirs just a few years old, had been laid out only the decade before. Now, the neighborhood stood under the shadow of architect Nicholas Hawksmoor's East End masterpiece, Christ Church, Spitalfields, itself only just completed in 1729, and you see it there from the view in the window. The two sisters were drawn to their new townhouse on one of Spitalfields' newer streets by the same thing that had brought many of their neighbors there too. They came from the industry that became synonymous with the area in the 18th century, silk weaving. For when the two sisters moved to London, it was in part so the younger of the two, Anna-Maria Garthwaite, could launch her career as a silk designer. Silk designers like Garthwaite were skilled laborers. Their work was to draw designs, such as the one on the left, which I hope you can make out, that is a Garthwaite design, to show weavers, such as those shown in Hogarth's famous print, to the right, what patterns of colors and decoration they should follow to create the lengths of silk on their looms. Many designers, accordingly, were weavers or trained themselves as master weavers. Silk designers almost always worked to commission, independently, to master weavers and mercers, as dealers in high-end fabrics were known. The London silk industry made all sorts of textiles, but was most renowned for its flowered silks, named for their floral or botanical patterns. Now, flowered silks were distinctively designed, produced to order, and generated in quantities usually limited to only 4 pieces woven from a single design. Most silk sold by mercers and merchants in the 18th century was plain silk, fabric of a single color without a pattern. So flowered silks, accordingly, always cost more than plain silk. They were harder to make. Depending on the pattern's complexity or whether it included metallic thread, flowered silks could sell for as much as double the price per yard of plain silk. Now, almost all Spitalfields silk was meant for clothing rather than interior decoration or upholstery. It was eventually used to make garments like elegant dresses and petticoats for women and elaborate waistcoats for men. Both of these are Garthwaite designs that were transformed into garments. Garthwaite was a highly prolific designer, and she drew hundreds of patterns over multiple decades. Their flowered silk blossoms curling across watercolor and pencil curves and grids of ruled paper. Her designs ranged from extremely naturalistic flowers and leaves to highly stylized Asian patterns, and they spread throughout the Atlantic world. From Scandinavia to South Carolina, men, women, and children walked, ate, danced, and posed for portraits wearing Garthwaite designed silks. And her silks survive in museums across Europe and America today, mutely shimmering testament to her long ago popularity. But Garthwaite's success, though undeniable, was improbable. Unlike many other known silk designers in 18th century London, who tended to be of French Huguenot descent, she was English. But as you probably have guessed, her distinctiveness lay most fundamentally in the simple fact that she was a woman. And although other women certainly worked in London's silk industry, there were more women working unskilled trades like throwing silk than there were men, for example. Few women worked as silk designers, and Garthwaite is the only such woman we know of whose designs survive. Moreover, most women who practiced skilled trades like weaving did so because their father or husband did too. And although women did weave in their own right alongside their husbands, and some women were made members of the Silk Weavers Guild, the regulation of the London's Weavers Company stipulated that generally the only women who might serve formal weaving apprenticeships and hence become members of the guild were daughters of weavers who had no sons. Garthwaite, by contrast, did not ply her trade because a male relative had done so, nor did she receive formal training as an apprentice or start her career as a young woman. Instead, Garthwaite, who never married, did not begin her professional design career until she was middle-aged. Moreover, her family background added to the already inherent improbability her gender and lack of formal training brought to her career of choice. For Garthwaite was no weaver's daughter. Instead, she was the daughter of a Cambridge-educated Anglican minister from Lincolnshire, with family connections to London's Royal Society and members of the English nobility. So the question is, how did this spinster daughter of a Lincolnshire minister manage, in her 40s no less, to launch a successful London design career? Why did she begin designing in the first place? How did she gain the technical expertise required to design complicated patterns for looms? Why did she move to London when she did? Why did she never marry? Some of these questions have no known answers, and unless a stash of previously unearthed evidence comes to light, some of them never will. And since my book is published, I sort of hope they don't, because then I'd have to revise the entire thing. But despite Garthwaite's prolific career, her popularity and her aesthetic influence, she thus remains somewhat of a personal enigma in terms of her biography. But in her own time, she was noted by contemporaries as one of only a few women silk designers. And family records and her own notations on her silk designs make it evident that she was not only literate but educated. She was financially solvent. Her father left her £500 when he died, and she died able to make respectable bequests of her own. There's no obvious reason, in other words, that her archival trail should be so faint. Yet she left little more documentation than an anonymous, illiterate, impoverished woman of her time might have done. There's minimal archival material beyond her will, no letters, no diaries, no business or advertising records. So her story serves as a reminder that sometimes even people who are educated and famous and well-known in their own time are silenced if we rely on traditional archival sources alone. She did, however, leave a rich trove of material and visual culture, and these objects and images speak for her. They include her designs, her house in Spitalfields, a cutwork landscape in paper she made as a young woman, the silk woven to her designs, and more than 800 labeled watercolor designs created from the 1720s through the 1750s. And these objects and images show us how material and visual culture give power to people long dead, otherwise inscrutable. And in this case, they begin to give voice to this otherwise mute figure. Now, casting historical light on the enigma that is Garthwaite also brings other women out of the historical shadows. She was not the only female producer in the male-dominated silk industry, nor was she the only woman to become an arbiter of fashionable taste or participate in transatlantic botanical networks, as I'll discuss today. And looking at her designs, we see her artistry, an individual expression not unlike words in a diary, that also tells us about the larger cultural history of the world in which she lived. Now, Garthwaite's designs were produced in metropolitan London in this corner townhouse. You can still go see it today. But they took shape within the context of transatlantic natural history networks, the reshaping of the British landscape, Britain's East Indies trade, and the demands of the North American colonial market. Garthwaite's designs created fashion, but they also narrated each of these histories. And to tell these stories, we'll start far from the hustle and bustle of Spitalfields, and we'll travel to the Lincolnshire countryside, where Anna Maria Garthwaite lived as a teenage girl. Now, when she was a teenage girl, she lived in the Grantham Rectory, over 100 miles north of London. It's doubtful that she, or anyone else for that matter, envisioned that a few decades later she'd be living in London designing silk. Even as a teenager, however, this clergyman's daughter showed artistic promise and a fascination with things botanical. You can see this in her 1707 cutwork design, an early record of her artistic ability in an elaborate paper landscape. Although set in the country, it's a crowded scene. Packed into a space little larger than 1 foot high and 1 foot wide were, among other things, nearly 30 trees of almost as many species, a manor house, a church, a fountain, deer, sheep, a carriage and four, formal gardens, fences, 15 people, and a windmill. And to create this paper landscape, she painted brown paper black, cutting shapes from it with a scalpel-like knife or fine scissors, and then pricking the surface of the paper with a pin and layering it on in tiny feather-like slivers, she carefully added dimension to it. And if you go to see this at the V&A where it's on display, up close you can see the sort of feathery effect of this dimensionality. To maximize the effect of this dark landscape, she placed it on a sheet of fine white vellum. And as a final touch, as a helpful thing to historians of the future, she memorialized her patient work with a cutout of her name and the date, Anna Maria Garthwaite, 1707. Now, her landscape centers on a Carolean manor house, surrounded by a walled formal garden, laid out in ornamental geometric patterns in the French or Dutch fashion of the time. Carolean architecture, of course, was a recognizably English architectural building style, and beyond the walled gardens of this Carolean house is an equally recognizable English landscape. Dominating this view is a wooded park crowded with trees in many different species. Fences and hedges enclose part of the landscape, reflecting changes in the English countryside brought about by the enclosure movement. The scene also has touches of the innocent and the pastoral. Deer abound, and an ordinary laborer provides a pan-like touch by playing the flute while relaxing under a tree with a dog. Someone of higher rank also approaches to enjoy this estate's bucolic pleasure, driving toward the house in a carriage and four, which you can see there, emblazoned with a coat of arms and horses in full livery and feathered headdresses. But most of the people in the scene are laborers. More specifically, they are gardening. This landscape, although rural, is far from natural or wild. Rather, it has been carefully constructed and shaped in ways both rudimentary and sophisticated. In the village, a man tills his garden. On the enclosed estate, 2 men plant a sapling, a third prunes a tree, and a ladder leaning against yet another tree hints at work done there too. Many of the trees show signs of pruning, and workers in the ornamental gardens trim topiaries. Some of the trees, like the palm, which you can see, where's the palm tree? Right there, are species, of course, that are not native to England or amenable to its climate at the time, and so would have been sheltered and raised in a hothouse in 1707. A man between the house and the village holds a telescope and surveys the land, a reminder, like the unseen hothouse, that this gardening is a learned scientific endeavor. Garthwaite's youthful landscape, in short, encapsulates a visual history of many things that shaped 18th century English landscapes: the rise of the country house, the lure of the Georgic, the artistic appeal of the rural laborer, interest in ornamental, scientific gardening, and the enclosure movement. Enclosure, of course, the process by which the government granted landowners rights to improve previously uncultivated lands and enclosure of formerly common lands, greatly changed the English countryside. And it began after 1660, but greatly accelerated between 1750 and 1800. And it had ramifications not only for England, but also for the wider British Empire, and I'll discuss some of that today. Britons around the globe transformed their landscapes into working agricultural and Georgic spaces. They also manipulated them to meet aesthetic conventions borrowed from the Dutch, the French, the Chinese, and their own ideas about the pastoral and the picturesque. Enclosure led to a greater fascination with the land as both a productive and a beautiful space. And it also inspired vastly increased efforts to construct and control it. And here you see an example of one of the estates, Belton House, that Garthwaite used for her inspiration for her cutwork piece. And if we think about the youthful Garthwaite, this teenage girl thinking about the enclosed landscape around her, we're reminded that intellectual fascination with ordering the natural world was not expressed only in more traditional forms of visual culture like a map or like a landscape design in a book. It could be found just as readily in an amateur cutwork landscape made by a clergyman's daughter. Now Garthwaite's designs, her silk designs, were also like enclosed landscapes, filled with flowers and plants. The flowered silks made from her design shaped a shared visual experience throughout the British Empire. And a gardener-like attention to the physical labor of transplanting and pruning behind the aesthetic of flowers and botanicals is found in her teenage cutwork piece, obviously. Now it's also evident in her later designs, and here I think you can see quite clearly how one of her first designs from the 1720s has a direct aesthetic homage to her teenage rendition of trees, and she grows much more sophisticated as time passes. As a flowered silk designer, and here you can see the sophistication over time passing that I just referenced, the adult Garthwaite was not unlike a gardener who worked with paper rather than plants, collecting and transplanting botanicals to make her textile patterns. And here in one of her designs from the 1740s, you can see one that might have appealed especially to consumers of silk who gardened themselves. Now this pattern for a multicolored brocade silk to be woven on a cream ground showed a customary variety of graceful botanicals and pretty flowers. What's unusual here, though, is that Garthwaite chose to show her plants growing from bulbs and roots, which you clearly see here, in such detail that they included trailing tendrils of capillary-like roots, as if they were just uprooted carefully from the soil, ready to be repotted or transplanted in a new patch of ground. And in doing this, Garthwaite was a botanical innovator, but her novelty was in fashion rather than in the soil or in the greenhouse. Her fabric designs included rather ordinary flowers and plants like honeysuckle, holly, auriculas, sweet peas, roses, strawberries, and morning glories, but they also held exotic botanicals like aloes and spotted wild tiger lilies. And including both types of botanicals, her popular designs both mirrored the larger British cultural fascination with gardens and things botanical, and helped to foster the craze for wearing botanical landscapes in silk around the British Atlantic world. Garthwaite's silk designs, perhaps not coincidentally, were enmeshed themselves in these same transatlantic natural history networks. And in this, she was not unlike some of her peers, because silk designers were familiar figures in London's scientific and learned community. In fact, the majority of the 18th century silk designers in Spitalfields, whose work has been identified, had a marked interest in natural history. But of these designers, again, Garthwaite was the sole woman. But like these men, Garthwaite too had strong personal ties to London's botanical and scientific community. And in Garthwaite's case, though, such natural history ties were indirect, familial ones, as being a woman kept her from membership in society open to men, such as the Royal Society of London. And in this situation, Garthwaite's relationship with her brother-in-law, an apothecary, Vincent Bacon, a member of the Royal Society, touted by no less a figure than Sir Edmund Halley for his botanical knowledge, seems to have been an particularly important relationship. Now, by the time Garthwaite and her brother-in-law Bacon were both adults, they were both living in Spitalfields, and their relationship had become close enough that Vincent Bacon made Garthwaite the guardian of his young daughter in the event of his death. As a member of the Apothecaries Guild, Bacon had access to the Chelsea Physic Garden, which you see here in a 1751 map, one of England's great botanical gardens, filled with exotic flowers and plants and maintained by the guild to which Bacon belonged. Now, obviously, women frequented the garden. You can get a hint of that by the fact that they are down here in the lower left of the map. But what women were not allowed to do, unless, or men for that matter, unless they had an entree through a member of the Apothecaries Guild, was to visit the Chelsea Physic Garden's off-limit spaces, such as its hothouse and its collection of dried flowers and plants. Garthwaite could have gained entry to these places with her brother-in-law Vincent Bacon, and I think this is of real importance with how of the moment her designs were in terms of botanical fashion. Now, as you can see, though, these women strolling on the banks are obviously being linked to the Chelsea Physic Garden, and I think this is an important reminder that in this sense, Garthwaite is not an anomaly. In 18th century Britain, women did not merely serve as passive recipients of male botanical knowledge. Instead, they visited places like Chelsea Physic Garden to view and sketch plants and flowers. Women, like men, engaged in active study of botanicals. And although Bacon could have provided Garthwaite initial and somewhat special entree to this world, particularly once Garthwaite's designs turned to the more naturalistic in the early 1740s, it seems certain that she not only visited the Chelsea Physic Garden and others like it, but also studied botanical illustrations herself. And such botanical drawings could be found in rarefied male-dominated libraries, which, like the Royal Society, which commissioned this set of aloes by Herat. But others were more popular and easily accessible to women, whether they, like Garthwaite, had male relations in the Royal Society or not. And one of them is this famous book, The 12 Months of Flowers. In 1730, engraver Henry Fletcher, London gardener Robert Ferber, and painter Peter Castiles, who himself was a designer who dabbled in both calico and flowered silk, published a series of Castiles flower paintings. Now, the book featured 12 different illustrations of elaborate floral bouquets, one for each month of the year. Each featured dozens of varieties of flowers and flowering plants that bloomed in a particular month, with the names of each carefully indexed below the image. Now, such prints were advertised as being suitable for framing as well as for perusal, but they also were meant to be accurate botanical depictions, and in some they displayed more than 400 species. So they also served as a sort of illustrated seed catalog. Now, that the book was both useful and ornamental and could appeal to everyone from needlework practitioners to gardeners helps to explain its popularity, which was immediate and widespread. Over 400 subscribers signed up to finance its first publication. And what's interesting from thinking about Garthwaite in this world is that no less than 1/3 of the subscribers who sponsored its initial publication were women. And they ranged in rank from duchesses and countesses to ordinary mistresses and misses. And the book proved so popular that other engravers and publishers knocked off cheap copies of it. So many copies appeared, in fact, that the engraver Fletcher was one of the key witnesses in parliamentary investigation into an Engraver's Copyright Act. The 1735 Act, popularly known as Hogarth's Act, because William Hogarth led the lobbying efforts to get it passed, was the first time British copyright legislation applied to visual culture, such as engraving, rather than just to literary works. In other words, this thing was popular enough to start a groundbreaking lawsuit. American colonists also bought the 12 Months of Flowers. In 1734, Virginian John Custis, who was a great aficionado of plants and flowers, wrote to London to a friend that he'd received the book and was, quote, very much pleased with the flower pieces you sent me, though he was chagrined that he did not get the 13th one with the subscriber's name on it, like another Virginia man had. He wasn't quite keeping up with the Joneses as he wished. Over 20 years later, the work continued to hold enough appeal that the widow of Custis's son reserved her set of this first edition of 12 Months of Flower for her own use from her deceased husband's estate. Now, this widow was Martha Dandridge Custis, the future wife of first President George Washington. And we know that Custis, as a widow, not only held on to the 12 Months of Flowers, but also bought Spitalfield's flowered silk. Like many colonial women who owned London silk, she wore it in the form of this golden yellow damask gown for her wedding. Now, as a widowed bride, she ordered the fabric herself from London merchants Robert Carey and Company, and left evidence of her personal taste in her request to them that the fabric be, quote, grave but not extravagant. Although she did wear it with purple shoes, so you wonder how grave her overall appearance actually was. So, less obviously than John Custis or Royal Society members, but no less truly, silk designer Anne Maria Garthwaite and women who wore her flowered silk like Martha Custis Washington were all part of a cultural milieu in which the scientific, the artistic, and the commercial coalesced. both women and men designed and wore flowered silk and engaged in botanical studies. Around the Atlantic, women in the British Empire actively participated in the same transatlantic culture, in which men used growing exotic plants, looking at botanical illustrations, and exchanging gifts of seeds as popular ways of claiming gentility as well as erudition. And looking at her naturalistic designs, we can see how Garthwaite's designs were part of these global botanical networks. Prosaic flowers and exotic plants bend seamlessly, fold neatly together in neat multicolored bouquets that twine gracefully around the page in gentle serpentine curves. And two of the designs that she drew in 1743 particularly well illustrate this. They feature aloes. And although by the 1740s aloes were more likely to be in British greenhouses via the Caribbean, they originally, of course, came from Africa. And aloes were one of the most fascinating botanical species to early Georgian gardeners. They were particularly celebrated in 18th century botanical circles for their visual variety. And Garthwaite accurately captured their celebrated diversity by drawing different types of aloes in patterns, using distinctive spiky leaves to set them apart. And she, in fact, labeled these designs as Aloe 1, Aloe 2, different types of aloes according to their species. So in both aloe designs, for example, from 1743, as you can see here, she combined prosaic florals, such as these above, with exotic plants. Now, the one that she designed for a brocaded tabby that she labeled in her index simply as aloe combines spiky aloe with roses. And despite its botanical impossibility, she took care to draw the hybrid plant realistically in a style that mimics botanical drawings done from life studies. Her designer's eye, in other words, shows the same fascinated appreciation for the plant embraced by members of London's Royal Society. Mingling the exotic with the local, she grafts an exotic import onto an English rose. And woven into a brocaded tabby silk, her aloe rose hybrid blossomed across the fabric, in which multicolored botanical plants and flowers floated on raised warp threads above a flatter cream background. Viewers of this silk, in other words, saw something very similar to a multicolored plant drawn and painted on white paper. Now, Garthwaite also used North American plants that all could be found exported into London gardens, including magnolia, Turk's cap lilies, and mountain laurel. Pennsylvania botanist John Bartram first sent live mountain laurel plants across the Atlantic to London in 1735, where they bloomed on their own accord by 1740. Similarly, he sent Turk's cap lilies between 1738 and 1740. And within a few years, both specimens also flowered in Garthwaite's designs. And you can see her wonderful spotted lilies over here. So like gardens in England and North America, flowered silk was material embodiment of the global culture of the curious. Far from being simply a frivolous, fashionable commodity, flowered silk in this instance could signify its wearer's participation in a global network of Enlightenment intellect. And we're accustomed to thinking of how women and men alike exchange natural history knowledge through physical plant and seed specimens in published visual and print culture like Mark Catesby's popular illustrated book of North America, and in private exchanges of letters in the Republic of Letters on both sides of the Atlantic. But in traveling around the empire, fashionable commodities, in this case silk, also transported natural history knowledge, a material parallel to the print culture and private letters which tied together the Republic of Letters. And this was especially important for women, excluded or underrepresented as they were in groups like the Royal Society of London and the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. So a woman's silk, in other words, might advertise her erudite hobbies as well as her fashion sense. The same learned members of the Royal Society who enjoyed flipping through the pages of Erard's aloe drawings surely would have enjoyed discussing exactly which aloe they were seeing on a woman's silk dress. A woman wearing a dress decorated with such aloes at the same time could use her silk as a way to interject her own knowledge of and affection for studying such exotic botanicals into a conversation. And such fashionable choices would not just capture visual attention, because in the 18th century world that also so delighted in visual and verbal puns and allusions, such images might also start conversations, and so they might build in more ways than one transatlantic communities. So long before they left London to be traded around the Atlantic, Anna Maria Garthwaite's designs were already part of a larger world. Like British landscapes and the British Empire itself, her silk designs were a mélange of the far-flung and the everyday, a blend of the European, African, Asian, and American. Each of these exotic sites of British imperial expansion was present in her designs through the plants and flowers she included. And she designed, in other words, topographical textiles, fabrics that matched the botanical landscape of Britain's global empire. Now, her design career coincided with all but the last few years that colonial North America was the Spitalfields silk industry's most important market outside of London. Textiles, wools, linens, and silks always ranked among the most important goods British manufacturers exported to their colonies, both in terms of quantity and profit. And although the smallest number in terms of quantity, silks, especially those woven with metallic threads, which could cost up to 9 times the amount of similar silk without metallic threads, were always among the most expensive fabrics that colonists imported. And if we shift our gaze from London across the Atlantic to the North American colonies, it foregrounds the significance of North American consumers in the history of English silk. In America, as in England, men and women wore clothes whose flowered designs mimicked garden landscapes they imposed on their environment and the goods they displayed in their domestic interiors. Women, here's an example of how closely I think you can see the Garthwaite design on the right mimics a botanical illustration on the left. I think a really stark comparison there. But if we go across to the Atlantic, you can see that women wore flowered silk dresses, brocaded silk shoes. Men wore waistcoats with floral embroidery and damask banyans, and these again are all Garthwaite designs that were made into silk and fabrics that survive in museums today. Men and women together lived in houses where flowered silk damask covered chairs and sofas and were draped around windows. Flowers picked from their gardens decorated their spaces, bringing their carefully landscaped gardens indoors. When Swedish-Finnish naturalist Peter Kalm traveled to Philadelphia in the 1740s, he noted that, as he termed them, English ladies in America put fine flowers gathered from their gardens in the fields and placed them as an ornament in the rooms. For English ladies in general are much inclined to have fine flowers all the summer long, in or upon the chimneys, sometimes upon a table or before the windows, either on account of their fine appearance or for sake of their sweet scent. And flowers were seen as something that would be not only gardened by ladies, but also put in pots and basins. And as the Female Spectator, a popular publication, assured its readers, flowers were one of a woman's most becoming ornaments, quote, even amidst the blaze of jewels and the glowing gold of the richest and best fancied brocade or embroidery. So not surprisingly, given their universal and becoming appeal, women often posed holding flowers in portraits, and here you see a colonial woman painted by New England artist Robert Feek holding a flower. So although both Kalm and the Female Spectator described women bringing flowers indoors, and they were commonplace in paintings of women, men also embraced them for interior decorating and as props in their portraits. And here you see the 1723 portrait of John Custis, the one who commissioned the copy of the 12 Months of Flowers, and who also asked a friend in London to find him paintings to put in the summer before the chimneys to hide the fireplace that were covered with floral paintings like those in the 12 Months of Flowers. So his taste in interior decorating, in other words, reflected his intellectual interest in botany, and he eagerly collected and grew specimens of flowers and trees. And his Williamsburg home in Virginia was noted for the elegance of its 4-acre garden. And here you see his portrait with him not only having a tulip there beside him, which you can see at the very bottom, but also holding a book called Of the Tulip, in case you didn't get his interest clearly enough. In other words, in America, as in England, interest in nature and botanicals spilled out far beyond landscapes and gardens. Britons around the empire embraced natural motifs in their interior spaces, their furnishings, and their portraits, as well as in their fashion choices. And in the colonies, men and women who wore flowered silks and cultivated fine gardens were fascinated by nature and botanicals in much the same way as Britons in England and around the empire. The difference, of course, was that in the colonies, such elite merchant families' dynastic standing relied on their cultivation of what they called the American wilderness, and they had to shape American landscapes into spaces that were productive and pleasing according to European standards, despite the differences in physical topography and natural resources, as well as the realities of their dispossession of land from Native Americans who did not go quietly in the face of this dispossession, and the presence, of course, of large numbers of enslaved African people and people of African descent to shape those landscapes. And this becomes clear in the case of a young woman in South Carolina, Eliza Lucas. In 1743, she wrote to a friend in London of her impression of an elaborately landscaped Carolina plantation. This is a very similar plantation to the one she describes, which unfortunately does not still exist in visual culture. The plantation she described was called Crowfield, and she writes of it thus. As you draw near, she wrote, new beauties discover themselves constantly to the gaze. Behind the neatly finished and elegantly furnished house itself is a landscape that immediately struck my rural taste. And this carefully constructed view included a thicket of young oaks, a bowling green, a wilderness, fish ponds, a Roman temple, as she termed it, smiling fields dressed in vivid green, and in the ornamental gardens closest to the house, a grass plot ornamented much this way in what she termed serpentine manner with flowers. Now, Crowfield Plantation was built along the Cooper River in 1730. Like so many people in South Carolina, including Eliza Lucas herself, its builders were Anglo settlers who arrived in South Carolina by way of the Caribbean. And they constructed a series of spectacular plantations that, despite their low country North American setting, strove to be as British as possible. And Eliza Lucas's description of Crowfield focused on the features of its view that deliberately evoked an English country estate. Among the elements she found most pleasing within this view was what she called the fine prospect of water from the house, created by the series of fish ponds. Here you see another view of the same plantation. This is very similar to what she described as the fine prospect of water from the house, created by a series of fish ponds, canal-like waterways that, as she termed it, stretched out into smiling fields dressed in vivid green, where Ceres and Pomona join hand in hand to crown the hospitable board. She has her classical moments. Now, Crowfield was renowned in Europe as well as in the colonies for the beauties of just what she's describing, its acres of formal gardens and landscaped grounds. But when Eliza Lucas viewed this fine prospect created by the canals and the fish ponds graced with a Roman temple, what she really looked upon was an irrigation system for rice fields. And when she described these smiling fields dressed in vivid green, fit for cavorting by Roman deities, in these plantation fields, in fact, the only Ceres and Pomona to be found, were enslaved people who very likely had been given similarly classical names by their slaveholders. Enslaved workers whose enforced labor provided the hospitable board that Lucas and the other white visitors enjoyed. Now, Lucas's choice to focus on the aesthetic rather than the productive elements of Crowfield's landscape, on beauty rather than labor, was a deliberate one. Lucas knew exactly what she was looking at. She was a plantation developer herself. She knew that what she looked at were rice fields, and she oversaw rice fields on multiple plantations of her own. She, much like Anne Maria Garthwaite in 1707, well understood the need to manipulate and control the natural landscape and the importance of those who labored on it to create a beautiful landscape tradition. Now, Lucas was from the West Indies and educated in England before she moved with her family to South Carolina in 1738. A year later, her father returned to Antigua to serve as governor, leaving his teenage daughter to run his 3 Carolina plantations. And she's famous for diving into growing indigo, and most of you probably know her as Eliza Lucas Pinckney. But her planting was not purely profit-driven. As she herself put it, she, quote, loved the vegetable world extremely. And because of this love, she also indulged in aesthetic landscaping, planting ornamental flower and botanical gardens in cedar groves, which she described as, in the terms of the gardens, ornamented in serpentine manners with flowers, as she did Crowfield. In other words, Eliza Lucas actively participated in both a willing aestheticization and intense productive labor of plantation landscapes. Hers was the gaze typical of 18th century colonials, who used a Georgic mode to conceptualize their landscape, just as the teenage Garthwaite showed both laborers and pretty trees in her cutwork piece. When Lucas detailed landscape elements at Crowfield, she mentioned a grove of trees, pools of water, a Roman temple, and fertile fields, all features evocative of Virgilian landscapes, of course, celebrated in Georgic poetry. And the year before she visited Crowfield, perhaps not coincidentally, she read Virgil, remarking that, quote, I am persuaded though he wrote in and for Italy, it will in many instances suit Carolina, for his calm and pleasing diction of pastoral and gardening evokes springtime on my own plantation. And although she wrote only a few years after the Stono Rebellion of enslaved workers in South Carolina reminded Carolina slaveholders of the violent reality that infused their colonial world, when she viewed Crowfield, she still celebrated it as a Georgic site, a peaceful colonial Augustan space in which landscape aesthetics subsumed the harsh realities of land cultivated through slave production. She did much the same with her own plantations, hailing their Virginian pastoralism while simultaneously scheming, as she put it, on how to use those landscapes and the enslaved people who labored on them to make a profit. And although she's famous for making indigo, one of the uses that she constantly found for her landscape was sericulture, or raising silkworms to make raw silk. Now, nearly 10 years after describing Crowfield, the colonial observer Eliza Lucas Pinckney had followed the path of her letter and was herself in London. And among the things she brought with her was raw silk produced on her Carolina plantation. There she supervised enslaved workers in the production of silk, where she planted mulberry trees to dot the landscape, both for beauty and as food for the silkworms. And when she was in London, she hired Spitalfields weavers to weave the strands of her South Carolina silk into lengths of fabric. And you see one of the surviving examples here, which you'll note is a very typical mid-18th century silk damask, English silk damask. And she gave pieces of the silk as gifts in England. She gave one length to Augusta, the Dowager Princess of Wales and patroness of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, who shared Pinckney's love of the vegetable world. She also kept fabric for herself. And the design of this fabric is very much in keeping with Garthwaite designs. And like these, her silk reflected the colonial plantation gardens she admired. They were all spaces ornamented in a serpentine manner with flowers. Now, Eliza Lucas Pinckney's shared visual and intellectual appreciation of both garden landscapes and flowered silk was far from a coincidental overlap. Both the garden landscapes she admired and the silk she produced and wore featured a similar aesthetic, the combination of naturalistic botanicals and serpentine lines we find in the work of Anna Maria Garthwaite. Flowered silks like these were topographical textiles that mapped the botanical reach of Britain's empire, and a common cultural landscape aesthetic embraced around that empire. Whether in naturalistic rococo brocade or stylized damask, people could wear flowered silk, as Pinckney did, to send messages of their individual connoisseurship in both fashion and science. And for colonial North American families like the Pinckneys, who moved onto Native American spaces and used enslaved labor to cultivate their plantation crops, fascination with manipulating that landscape was more than the intellectual exercise it could be for someone in London. Wealth, social stability, even safety from physical attack by enslaved people, Native Americans, or other European empires depended on the cultivation and management of local plants and landscapes. This conquest involved manipulating the landscape into places that were agriculturally productive and dotted with European-style permanent architecture. Colonial plantation landscapes required massive labor to manipulate in this way. And like the enclosed states in Great Britain they often emulated, they too used design aesthetics to elide over the work behind such manipulation. These spaces, landscapes that were actually laboriously wrought sites of agricultural production, could also be pleasing visual announcements of their owners' wealth and culture. Observers like Eliza Lucas could and did choose to envision Roman goddesses dancing around green fields dotted with ponds, where she actually saw enslaved people of African descent laboring to grow rice in irrigation ditches. In much the same way, silk could announce its wearer's status and refinement, such as in this portrait of another colonist from Pennsylvania, without providing any hint at all about the labor behind it, the thousands of dead silkworms and the weeks of hand labor behind them. Plantation landscapes and flowered silk, in other words, both hid the sometimes messy, often even violent, labor behind their production and the hardships endured by those who created them. Shipped from London across the Atlantic, Garthwaite's designs, such as this one, this is another Garthwaite design, wove picturesque landscapes into fabric, offering North American consumers a way to wear luxurious clothes that did more than announce their wearers' fashionable gentility. They also pronounced colonists and women's rights to participate in global botanical networks, while visually echoing the aesthetics of colonial landscapes that these men and women had reshaped, cultivated, and profited from. Thank you very much.